working at the Institute of History, Ethics, and Theory of Medicine at the University in Magdeburg. That institute is directed by Eva Brinkschulte. Perhaps you have already seen her. She was the moderator of the last panel. So as my research interests are, or one of my research interests is the history of genetic counseling in the GDR and also the history of eugenics in the first half of the century. And as these issues are also linked to the history of reproduction, I'm very interested and looking forward to our talks. So just how this will proceed, we will first listen to the talks and afterwards we will have the discussions. So please post your questions directly in the chat. So before we start, I would like to shortly introduce Stefan Jehne. Stefan studied in Leipzig and Berlin history with a focus on modern and contemporary history. Already during his studies, he worked in various projects in this field. For example, he was a co-worker in the memorial book on for the victims of NS euthanasia in Saxony. His central research interests are the history of eugenics and biopolitics in the 20th century and the associated crimes. Now he's a PhD student at the Humboldt University in Berlin and at the Leibnitz Center of Contemporary History in Potsdam. His thesis is focused on sterilization discourses and practices in the Soviet occupation zone and the GDR. So please, Stefan, we are looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Susanne, for this warm introduction and as well the invitation so that I can present some findings of my doctoral thesis, even if I'm, or even if it's still work in progress and I'm not finished. First of all, could everyone see my presentation?
Yes.
Wonderful. So yeah, before I start, I would say something about the presentation. I have put on some basic data concerning the actors I will mention in my presentation. So hopefully it helps to contextualize these actors. Yeah, now I will start with their command number 6, published on January 8th, 1946. The Soviet military administration in Germany abolished the Nazi sterilization law in the Soviet occupation zone and declared it as Nazi injustice. So forced eugenics, led by the state, officially ended. In consequence, several doctors and former lawyers who had participated in the implementation of the Nazi sterilization law were prosecuted during the 4 years of the Soviet occupation zone. But district court in Cottbus in March 1946, 3 accused doctors were legally convicted. From the beginning, the relevant German organizations of health and justice were mostly opposing the initiative to take participants of sterilization practices during the Nazi period to court. For example, the president of the Department of Justice in the Soviet occupation zone, Eugen Schiffer, and the later first Attorney General of the GDR, Ernst Mehlsheimer, argued after the Cottbus trial that prosecute doctors for being involved in sterilizations would lead to a systematic flight of medical doctors to the Western occupied areas, because the majority of them had been involved in the complex of National Socialist sterilizations. But these pragmatic motivations were not the only reason why Schiffer, Mehlsheimer, and other officials intervened to stop prosecutions. Another reason was the existence of differing and ambivalent attitudes concerning the legal evaluation of sterilizations in Nazi Germany in the relevant organizations. Even the judges in the Cottbus trial constructed a dichotomy between eugenically forced sterilizations during the National Socialist regime and sterilizations under democratic conditions in their judgment. However, the German efforts had been successful. In May 1946, the Soviet military administration passed a new command which defined only those sterilizations from Nazi times as crimes against humanity, which had been racially or politically motivated, as opposed to those for eugenical reasons. Despite the abolition of the Nazi sterilization law by the Soviets, medical doctors continued their internalized administrative practices from the Nazi period and asked for sterilization permissions. But two substantial differences between the Nazi period and the Soviet occupation zone and the early GDR in this regard can be recognized immediately. First, in the 4 years of the Soviet occupation zone, there had been approximately 50 reports, which not include the not clearly definable dark figure of non-registered reports or really executed sterilizations. In the Nazi period, we can verify about 1,000 accomplished sterilizations. The other big difference is the fact that in the Soviet occupation zone and the GDR, all votes were at least formally voluntary. The conceptual background refusing compulsory sterilizations but approving voluntary sterilizations reaches back to the social democratic and socialist biopolitical programs in the Weimar Republic, as Michael Schwarz has shown in detail. Especially the regions of Saxony and Thuringia had been pioneers concerning discourses as well as illegal practices of sterilization before 1933. So, in a certain way, it is no surprise that the first demand to regulate sterilizations by law, which was sent to the Central Health Department of the Soviet occupation zone in Berlin, was formulated by the Saxonian state government in January 1948. The responsible employee in the Central Health Department, Vladimir Lindenberg, expressed in an internal letter that he fully sympathized with the Saxonian demand. Together with the Central Department of Justice, the Central Department of Health tried to define a legal framework to outline the circumstances in which sterilizations would not be illegal or in violation of good behavior. So it was again Vladimir Lindenberg who took up communication with the Department of Justice at the beginning of 1948. He argued that sterilizing for medical reasons was indisputably legal, and he further argued that it should be legal, quote, in all other cases too. These other cases were, quote, a clear, verifiable hereditary disease, which points to eugenical motivations, the, quote, social situation, which points to social motivations, and, quote, the existence of a libidinous psychopathic personality, which points to psychiatric motivations. Almost 2 weeks after the letter of Lindenberg to the Central Department of Justice, a meeting of section leaders took place within the Central Department of Health. The head of the section of staff and instructions, Karl Kutel, stated that eugenically as well as socially motivated sterilizations could not be legalized. Only in cases of medical indications, sterilizations must be, quote, tolerated. The clear disapproval of eugenically and socially indicated sterilizations, which Kutel displayed, makes sense with regard to his biography. Already in the Weimar Republic, he was a member of the Communist Party, which had regularly refused eugenically motivated sterilizations by defining them as, quote, class medicine. For example, Georg Benjamin, the brother of Walter Benjamin, a famous communist physician, did so. Astonishingly, Vladimir Lindenberg brought his position into line with Kutel's, apparently a clear statement approving of eugenically motivated sterilizations was not appropriate within the Central Department of Health. Although their president, Karl Linzer, agreed with the position of Karl Kutel and gave Lindenberg an instruction to prepare a bill regulating the sterilization topic. Lindenberg left the organization during 1948, so it was not him, but employee Marie Schulte-Langford who prepared the pertinent bill in August 1948. As Kutel and others before, she argued that sterilizations for medical reasons should be legal, but not for social reasons, because the social situation of people was submitted to change and because all of the relevant organizations in the Soviet occupation zone were working on solutions to improve the social situation of the whole population. But in the next step, she said that it was necessary to respect the wish of someone to be sterilized if he or she was mentally or physically ill. Her statement should be seen as pro-eugenics, although the internal vote in the Central Health Department concerning eugenically indicated sterilizations was clearly against them. The bill of Schulte was not internally accepted, so she modified it, and in the new version of October 1948, she was much more reserved regarding eugenically motivated sterilizations. However, the bill of Schulte-Langford did not achieve force of law. In further debates between Langford and the relevant employees of the Central Department of Justice, no agreement was achieved. So the many debates within and between the relevant organizations ended without any legal regulation at the end of 1948. The informal practice of medical doctors report people to be sterilized went on and was not touched at all by these debates on the ministerial level. It was common practice during the 4 years of the Soviet occupation zone that medical doctors requested the sterilization of women together with the request for abortion. On the level of the local health departments, committees of experts were authorized to give permission to abort or not. Abortions could in principle be authorized by the Committee for Medical, Eugenical, Social, or so-called ethical reasons. One example of an eugenical indication is the case of Irmgard P. from Leipzig in June 1949, who was said to be, quote, deaf and dumb. She has allegedly requested her own sterilization in the aftermath of her requested and approved abortion at the health department of Leipzig. Her request, which was signed by her but obviously not written by her, was eugenically motivated in the contemporary understanding of eugenics. It was claimed that she was, quote, mentally below average, that her deafness was heritable, and that she already had one child who had been, quote, a problem child from the beginning. If she would have more children, these were expected to be, quote, inferior to. The health department of Leipzig sent the request to the health department of the state of Saxony in Dresden, and the head of this department, Friedrich Winkler, decided to authorize the request sterilization without any legal basis. As I mentioned, the legalization of formally voluntary sterilizations for eugenical reasons was discussed several times but officially refused. So Winkler concealed the true reason for Irmgard P.'s sterilization in his permission paper on June 27, 1949. Formally, he gave his permission for medical and social reasons. 3 weeks later, the Central Health in Berlin finally passed official regulation concerning this complex. Henceforth, volunteering of women for strictly medical indications were legal, but not the other potential indications. But this did not end attempts to sterilize people for eugenical reasons. For instance, in December 1949, the married couple Oscar and Charlotte T. wrote to the Saxonian State Department of Health asking to sterilize Charlotte T. The request was supported by an assessment of the medical doctor Elfriede Ochsenfahrt, who was a psychiatrist from 1939 onwards, and the Psychiatric State Institute of Großschweidnitz in Eastern Saxony, which was a hub of the so-called decentralized euthanasia during the Nazi period. In her assessment, Ochsenfahrt argued that T must be sterilized because she was schizophrenic and that it was therefore absolutely necessary to prevent further pregnancies and, quote, hereditary offspring. Although there was no legal basis to ask for eugenical sterilizations, Ochsenfahrt tried to get a permission to sterilize someone for such reason. This problem was recognized by the Saxonian State Department of Health in Dresden, and the rejection of the request was justified with the legal position that eugenically motivated sterilizations are simply forbidden. In April 1950, the topic of how to deal with eugenically and socially indicated sterilizations was then made a top priority by the leading health Zetkin. Zetkin wrote to the party executives of the Socialist Party, German Sozialistische Einheitspartei Deutschlands, and the short form SED, that on the one hand, he could absolutely understand the wish to sterilize women due to bad perspectives of the hereditary status of their offspring, but that on the other hand, he could understand the hesitant attitude of the Central Health to regulate the topic by law. In consequence, he argued against the legalization of eugenically motivated sterilizations for political reasons. Zetkin showed sympathies as many other officials and medical doctors concerning the concept of eugenical sterilizations. But regarding compulsory sterilizations, he made clear that it was politically impossible to boot own eugenically motivated campaigns and practices so far after the recent Nazi sterilizations. This was obviously ranked higher than the acceptance of eugenics as a serious biopolitical concept in general. There's no recorded answer from the SED executives, but the practice of sterilization requests continued throughout the 1950s, and health officials kept on demanding the creation of a sterilization law. For example, in November 1950, the head of the Gynecological Clinic of the University of Rostock, Hans-Hermann Schmidt, and in January 1958, his colleague from the Department for Social Hygiene, Karl-Heinz Milan, both called for a sterilization law based on eugenic ideas. Directly supported by the gynecological clinics, universities at Jena, Leipzig, and Halle. Like the judges in the Cottbus trial, he tried to construct a difference between National Socialist forced eugenical sterilizations and sterilizations under democratic conditions. However, the GDR Central Department of Health in Berlin did not give in to the demands of the academics. No law was passed to regulate this complex. The same was true for the case of Milan. He was one of the most popular public medical scientists in the GDR. Nowadays, he's mostly known for being the father of the anti-baby pill in the GDR. Milan was professionally socialized in the National Socialist period. With consideration to his request in 1958, I assume that he had completely internalized the National Socialist interpretation of the eugenical terminology. In his request, he talked about, quote, imbecile psychic children who will flood the recreation centers if they were not aborted before. He further wrote that it was necessary to sterilize the mothers because, quote, unfortunately, there were some antisocial, moronic, and instinctively girls who get pregnant all the time if they were not sterilized. His request was not successful too, but he did not suffer any consequences. In summary, I will again emphasize my most important findings. Sterilizations as a biopolitical concept were discussed in phases and remained somehow open-ended. Sterilization demands were practiced at least to the stage of requesting. So, the continuity of eugenical debates and practices after the end of World War II can clearly be determined. But as I pointed out, every request of sterilization was formally declared to be voluntary. Compulsory sterilizations, like those in the Nazi period, were in principle out of question and not part of any discourses. On the level of medical doctors, it is not impossible that National Socialist ideologies concerning so-called hereditarily ill persons continue to have an effect. But on the level of the health department, the debates seem partially to be a serious attempt to argue for legalization of eugenically motivated sterilizations by simultaneously acting the variant. But those considerations were only possible in theory, because as the expressions of Zetkin exemplified, the politically motivated delimitation from the abuse of sterilization regime made it practically impossible to pass an own sterilization law based on eugenics. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Stefan, for this really interesting talk. And as I said before, I will now go on with the next talk. I will introduce now our next speaker, that is Michalina Augusiak. And I would like to introduce her. She studied history and culture studies and philosophy at the University of Warsaw. Her research interests include topics related to the history of science and expert knowledge, the history of social reproduction, and transnational networks of socialist women's activism. She's currently working as a research assistant at the Institute of Slavic Studies of the Polish Academy of Science, and she also works as a curator. At the moment, she is curating a series of events called Care Revolutions for the Biennale Warsaw. And there she works with feminist scholars studying the care crisis, as well as workers and labor activists in social reproduction sectors. So we are looking forward for your talk.
Thank you, Susanne, for your introduction. I will now share my my screen. Okay, it's loading. Can everyone see the presentation? Yes. Okay, perfect. So first of all, I've mentioned this to the organizers and to Susanne, but I just want to sort of give a heads up to anyone who's seeing a slight cosmetic difference between the title that I proposed and which is in the booklet and the title on the screen. When I first proposed this paper, I intentionally chose a pretty broad title, which could give me the freedom to sort of like explore different components of the material that I was working with. But since I've since had the time to get into the more like analytical part of my research, I have felt like I should just go ahead and like share the subheading that I'm working with right now. So the full title that I'm using for this paper, and which the possible published version of this might take form, which might take form at some point, be called, is The Male Factory: The Science of Male Fertility and Infertility in the Reproduction Economy of State-Socialist Poland. And the reason I wanted to make this change and say, explain why I was making it, is because I feel it's actually a pretty good segue into explaining why I'm linking certain perspectives and contextualizing the scientific and medical aspect of my research in a certain way. So what I mean by that, and let me just skip over to the introduction page, is that I believe that the explanatory potential of historical scholarship devoted to biological reproduction can really greatly gain from perspectives that are drawn from studies of social reproduction models and their economic structures. So I wanted to contextualize my overview of the expert culture surrounding the science of male fertility and infertility in state-socialist Poland, with looking at the evolutions of family law under state socialism, looking at how it regulated the social distribution of resources through the measure of alimony, which I'm making the claim was the primary force driving the development of male fertility scholarship for a long time after the war, and how the question of men's ability to conceive offspring was central to the economic and forensic regimes underpinning these processes. So to just shortly give you an idea about the sources that I'm working with and that I'm going to be talking about today, I was mostly using publications of the fertility and infertility section of the Polish Gynecological Society, as well as sources of the Society for Conscious Motherhood, and then legal documents and books on the topic of paternity inquiries in terms of forensic medicine and the legal structures of it. And the two most important research questions that I'm working with are what ideas about masculinity were articulated in the scientific and popular writing about male infertility and fertility under state socialism. And secondly, how did the economic and cultural requirements of legal paternity inquiries influence research into male infertility and fertility once again. So I'm now skipping over to a very short introduction of the legal aspect of it, just that we're all on the same page in terms of what I'm going to be talking about later. And the important things to know about the legal framework that this entire expert culture of andrology research on male fertility is going on in, is the framework set up by the 1946 family law, which is introduced quite quickly after the end of the war as a measure meant to really finally bring a unified legal structure to family and civil law, which in interwar Poland really was, was the element of the legal system that didn't really have the time or political ambition to be really unified. So after the war, the situation in Poland is basically that family law it's not unified. It was not unified in the interwar period. So in some parts of the country, you still have remnants of the Napoleonic Code, which has very sort of different, a very different approach to the question of determining fatherhood through legal means from the Soviet system. So what happens in 46 is basically that the question of determining paternity becomes one of the central elements of the new family law. In some ways, the children who are born in sort of extramarital contexts are gain a similar legal status as those born inside marriages. But at the same time, in terms of the institution of alimony, a very sort of an important thing happens, which then has a lot of consequences for what how the studies of fertility, male fertility then develop, which is that the presumption of fatherhood on the sort of on the side of the man who is legally married to the mother is written into law, and a lot of the system of like alimony really becomes like a driving force for a lot of research. And the early methods used in paternity inquiries are serological methods, so basically blood type tests, which are based on these like really, you know, traditional structures of like Mendel's laws of heredity. And what you're seeing here in terms of the graphic is a graphic taken from a publication by Ludwig Hirschfeld, so a very sort of famous Polish microbiologist and serologist, who the publication was a reissue of his publication from the 30s, which is made to sort of, which is updated and expanded in order to include issues, well, new sort of like scientific information, but also issues which are supposed to sort of answer the legal problems, the medical problems which are being produced by this new law, which centers alimony as a sort of central mechanism of ensuring resources for vulnerable citizens, such as children. And alimony is a system which sort of has a very ambivalent status in terms of Eastern European state socialism. It was very much opposed by early Soviet revolutionaries, such as Alexander Kollontai, for example, as a system sort of which privatizes the responsibility for caring for childcare, for resources for children, in a way that sort of is not like inherently socialist, and strengthens the family form, the nuclear family form, and biological ideas of kinship. But that's sort of the context in which really research into paternity, into heredity, and then with time into fertility really develops in state socialist Poland. Okay, so this is the sort of a short overview of how the research into fertility itself becomes institutionalized. So a really key element of this process is obviously the establishment of the Society for Conscious Motherhood, in 1957, which many scholars have pointed to as really the sort of watershed moment of research and writing on biological reproduction in Poland in different contexts. So the research on male fertility, which develops at around the same time, like one of the first sort of publications appear in the late 50s, but most of the research institutionally is really sort of coupled with existing obstetrics clinics and gynecology clinics, gynecology wards, or women's health clinics. And as one gynecologist noted, gynecologists are now sort of the ones who have to play the role of andrologists in Poland, which, as he states, was served by dermatologists before the war. So really gynecology, obstetrics, and the sort of institutional structure of the Society for Conscious Motherhood, which obviously has regional clinics, etc., is the institutional sort of landscape within which the andrological research on male fertility and infertility develops. And the sort of defining moment in terms of really the networking of this field, etc., is when the fertility and infertility section of the Polish Gynecological Society is set up, which happens sort of gradually in the early 60s, and which I think tells us a lot about how that sort of hotly debated topic at the time, they decide, so that there's a vote in 62, and they decide that the first ever symposium of the section is supposed to be sort of devoted exclusively to what they call the male factor in marital infertility. And the male factor, as I sort of, which I've referenced in the title of my paper, is really sort of like the key term that is used in terms of male fertility studies. But here in 63, we can see that it's sort of very closely linked to the question of marital infertility. So it does have like a very direct link to the question of, well, how can we sort of make marriages which don't sort of serve the key reproductive purpose sort of work. And there's really like a surprising range of research from lots of different clinics, mostly Warsaw, Potsdam, Gdańsk, Lublin, Doetz. But there's really like a number of institutions which become really involved in the activities of the section. And they also call for a unification commission, which could be tasked with creating a unified terminology and examination methods, which are supposed to serve the sort of examination methods that they mention are supposed to serve the sort of forensic framework, which is mostly used for determining paternity in alimony cases. And I wanted to also like mention shortly that the key, I think, ideas about masculinity and what can cause infertility in men are one, the question of alcohol, which also appears in a lot of like advice books and popular writing. For example, the Sexual ABC of Man by Jadwiga Bokre. The idea that sort of excessive alcohol use, which is very much linked, especially by women's activists and health activists with masculinity, can damage the sort of genetic material of men, which either is supposed to make insemination less possible, or even produce somehow non-normative outcomes in terms of the resulting organisms. And the second one is case studies carried out in dangerous labor environments, which are often also like linked to masculinity. So there's lots of studies which are carried out in steelworks or sites affected by radiation, and all like typically dangerous male sort of sites of labor, which women are not supposed to, at this point, really occupy. And the second event that I want to mention is a conference in Potsdam in '68, which was sort of spells out its forensic element in its own title, which was organized by the local sort of regional office of the Society for Conscious Motherhood, and very much sort of markets the publication, the result of publication markets itself to lawyers very much. So it doesn't, it's very much aware that it has these sort of legal ambitions. And the outcome of the conference and the sort of the talks around it is that the Forensic Medicine Committee of the Ministry of Health and Welfare in the same year sort of finally realizes the demand of the andrology sort of experts, and sets up a set of rules for all labs, which really, provide expertise for paternity inquiry cases, which are supposed to have more detailed and modern methods, and sort of a more modern apparatus in terms of analyzing biological samples, both blood samples and semen samples, and are supposed to have these like unified requirements. So the growing sort of andrology network of scientists starts to successfully make demands of the legal system. And then the third event that I want to mention, which I think brings us to an arch which can show the evolution of the sort of framework, the economic framework, the legal framework that male fertility and infertility is studied in, is the fifth symposium of the fertility and infertility section, which is held 15 years after the first one. And here I've chosen a quote from Mieczysław Stefan, who is the voivode of Lublin, so the sort of highest local representative of local government, who was invited to sort of give a speech at the beginning of the symposium. And here he very directly sort of gives a quote which speaks to the, as he names it, the biological potential of the nation, but which we could analytically frame as the sort of demographic ambitions of the state, and also like centers the institution of the family, obviously, in this process. And sort of moving on to my conclusions, because I think I'm running out of time, Susanne, right? Yeah. I just want to mention that the 70s were a time where the sort of conjuncture of legal, economic, and technological that so far has sort of defined what the expert culture around male infertility in state-socialist Poland was, especially sort of since the late 50s, with the growth of this sort of andrological research, which mostly paid attention not to blood work, but to semiological analysis and fertility work, is the 70s really like changed the framework that it exists in. And there are a few reasons for that. One, there is the introduction of a centralized alimony fund, which sort of deprivatizes the system, which is supposed to really allocate resources to children, and sort of centralizes it and puts more responsibility on the state. So sort of makes children and their guardians less dependent on men and their sort of economic support. Then there's the widely discussed demographic slump, sort of beginning in the late 60s, which happens in the 70s. And three, the technological advancements linked to artificial insemination all sort of push the science of male fertility away from forensic paternity inquiries and towards a search for new therapies and methods of substituting infertile biological material in the insemination process. So I just wanted to say that sort of the conclusions sort of that I'm presenting here are really mostly conclusions which work in the sort of period of late 1950s, where the sort of andrological framework of research develops, till the 70s, where the context changes. But at this period, I think that really the main objectives driving the development of research into male fertility and infertility are the need to develop more reliable methods, and really like ever more reliable methods. That's sort of how the scientists speak about it, of determining paternity, underpinned by an alimony system based in the privatizing logic of biological kinship relations as the default source of resources. And then the demographic ambitions of the state, which I mentioned, and which was illustrated by the quote from the regional government sort of official. Okay, so that's it. I'll stop sharing. Thank you very much. I hope I wasn't too bad on time. Susanne, I think you're still mute.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay. We are a little bit over, but we still have some time for discussions. So I don't see any question in the chat, so I will start and have time to put my questions. Okay, so my first question go to Stefan. And Stefan, I would like to ask you, would you say that the discourse of eugenic in the GDR and also before has a continuity not on the eugenic, I mean, in the National Socialist time, but on the socialist eugenic in the Weimar Republic, or also is it comparable more to the forms of eugenic we can find at the Scandinavian states, where we also have this mixture often between eugenic and social reasons?
Thank you for this question. Well, I think it depends. So on the ministerial level, where you can find a lot of employees who had been emigrated during the Nazi period, for example, Zetkin, that I have mentioned, but a lot of others, or who had been already involved during the Weimar Republic in politics of health, for example, Alfred Bayer. There you can see this continuity, of course, to have these, like import of ideas from Weimar times, and you can see it in the biographies of the relevant employees. But I think on the level of medical doctors, it is obviously it is difficult to examine it from the sources, but I think, for example, in cases of medical doctors who have been involved in the sterilization complex during the Nazi period, which had been almost every medical doctor, there it is mostly a continuity of these practices from the Nazi period. And those, like, even, for example, Oxenfeld, she tried to suggest that the sterilization request is voluntary by the victim, but I think that is just because she knows it is impossible to just say in public that she wants to continue with compulsory sterilization like in the Nazi period.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot. Here are now two questions to Michalina. I will read it. The first is, do your sources include any discussions of karyotyping and Klinefelter syndrome?
Okay, in terms of the sort of chromosomal context, which I guess I could extend this question into, there isn't much. They're much more sort of focused on the sort of biochemical aspect of their research, and the question of like how different forms of labor affect and produce sort of non-normative forms of reproductive biology. But there is some, it's not very widely talked about. There's some like individual case studies that I've noticed. Yes.
Okay.
That's all I can say really, but there are some, there are not very many.
Okay, thank you. And there is, I will continue with another question here in the chat for you. That is, was male infertility always regarded negative? Or did the actors saw advantages such as infertile alcoholics or vasectomy as a male contraception?
Well, I guess in terms of the discourse produced by the fertility and infertility section, which is obviously not the only like actor, right, which produces discourse, which is just the most sort of medically legitimate sort of actor. That's why I sort of chose them. They don't really have that much sort of social commentary that they produce themselves. They're very much sort of focused on responding to the needs of the state and the legal system, and sort of refining their methods as a way of really also establishing their own value, like for the state, because like all of them are really like working as experts in legal cases. So they don't really have that much sort of social commentary themselves in terms of, I don't know, like linking infertility to some social degeneracy or something, which I think you're alluding to here. And they don't really like discuss vasectomy, which I find surprising, but they really don't. They do mention a lot of like more like physical methods, but they're always methods of treatment, possible treatment. So I would say that like there's not a very, there isn't really space for them to even think of whether that's sort of like positive or negative. It's like always negative. There's always an attempt to really like normalize the sort of biological process of reproduction.
Okay, thanks a lot also for your answers. And then there is no question, then I will go on with a question. Stefan, would you mind to say a few words on your sources you worked with?
Well, yes. Yeah, that's somehow a problem because, yeah, that's the advantage if you are doing research on the Nazi period, because, yeah, during the Nazi period, it was formally legal to sterilize by law. So you know where you can search for it. So it is a little bit more difficult, but of course I've yeah, looked on the ministerial level of health in the Bundesarchiv Lichterfelde. You have like these the correspondence and the communication that I have referred also in my presentation. You can find there, and then on the local level, as I mentioned, you can find some requests in together with the requests of abortion. So there you can like search in the archives, but at least it is difficult because there's no clear defined yeah, how do you say it, there you can't like search like in the Nazi period, for example, Erbgesundheitsgericht, and then you know there are the relevant documents. So it is, yeah, somehow you have to be somehow a detective.
Okay, thanks. Here now several questions pop up now. So the next also to you, Stefan. Had there been any reflections in the GDR on the case of Dr. Dorn, Hanover, in the 1960s?
Well, I don't know yet, because, yeah, obviously, because of the pandemic situation, I have problems like everyone else, every researcher to yeah, get into research in archives. So the 1960s, yeah, I didn't examine yet, so I don't know, but I assume that of course it has been recognized in the GDR, because as you, for example, as you can see in the person of Karl-Heinz Milan, most physicians in the DDR were well connected to their Western colleagues. So, of course, I think it has been recognized, sure.
Okay, so there are two more questions, and then I will also, considering the time, will finish. But these questions, that is one to Michalina and one to Stefan. So I will first take the one for Michalina. And that is also concerning, again, vasectomy. In the period of your study, wasn't this procedure illegal or at least legally dubious? And there is a note on the notes of rendering someone sterile being a variation of grievous bodily harm and Polish penal code.
Yeah, so I'm not really like that well versed in terms of like other aspects of the law. I'm not a legal historian, so this is just like a but in terms of what they were writing, it obviously there was a great sort of attention also to not having the state as sort of or as an employer, most importantly, never to sort of put citizens in situations which could result in sterility. So there was a lot of the research that I mentioned on on the influence of heat, on the influence of radiation, and different sort of like disadvantageous, dangerous labor environments. It was very much sort of thought about as a way of ensuring that the state doesn't produce bodily harm and doesn't produce sterility. They didn't really like come into that much contact with the legal aspect of it, because what they were focusing on was responding to the existing legal structure, and sort of refining their own methods.
Okay, thank you. And I have another question here for Stefan. And I mean, there's a thank you to both of you. And then the question is, you did mention that sterilization happened voluntarily. Can you say a bit more about the process of decision-making beyond the application? It is possible that medical personnel pressured persons in their decision.
Yes, I would assume that, obviously. So that's the reason why I said formally voluntary. So it had to be formally voluntary. So it was impossible, like in the Nazi period, where it was legalized by law, even without without the voluntary of the victims, but in the GDR and SBZ times, it had to be formally voluntary. But I would assume, of course, that they had been pushed into sterilization, of course. Even in those times where you can verify even more hierarchical society, and of course if the physician said it to someone that of course it had been a push in the direction. So I would assume that.
Okay, thank you. And here our last question goes to Michalina. Could you speak a bit more about the Society for Conscious Motherhood that you mentioned at the beginning? Did any parallel fatherhood organizations emerge around the same time as more energy was being invested in matters of paternity?
Short answer is no, and sort of there isn't an andrological society set up. It's only set up in 1993 in Poland. So sort of women's health and gynecology and obstetrics sort of remain as the existing institutional structure within which sort of paternity and male fertility is studied, treated. So there isn't like an equivalent. And in 1979, if I'm correct, the Society of Conscious Motherhood changes its name. And it's then called the Society for the Development of the Family. So it sort of gets a broader name, which is able to sort of include all the actual sort of aspects of the society's activities, which obviously at this point don't really apply to just motherhood. But the society sort of remains sort of the institutional sort of base for a lot of this work on fatherhood as well.
Okay, so thank you so much. Thanks a lot to our speakers for your very interesting talks, and thanks also for the vivid discussion afterwards. We are a little bit over our time, but not so much. And I would like to to mention the next panel that will start on 4:30 p.m. And the name is Silent and Noisy Revolutions, Discourses on Reproduction in Late 20th Century. And I say goodbye to everybody. Okay, thanks and goodbye.
Thank you, Susanne, as well for chairing our panel.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.